Welcome back, everybody. I hope that you've missed us. My name is Matthew McQuilla. I am back with Professor Larry Catá to discuss his book, Hong Kong Between One Country and Two Systems. Today, we are discussing chapter 20. We've made it to the 20s. This is Open Shut Strategy, Xi Jinping, Stopping the Storm and Restoring Order in Hong Kong's Most Urgent Task at Present. This is written Monday, November 18, 2019. How are you doing, Professor Backer?
Very well, thank you. Nice fall day, it's beautiful, and I'm excited about the opportunity to talk just a little bit about this chapter.
It appears this was written on a nice fall day too, but it wasn't written really about anything that was nice and calm like the fall days that we've come to love and know. So we talked about the open shut strategy and stopping the storm. What was so significant about this part?
Well, this is, you'll have to read the chapter for those of you who are listening in to see how I tie this into the Chinese rhetorical techniques, especially mend break, which we'd already been talking about, breaking something to mend it, mending something to break something else, then open shut, these binaries that are not really binaries in the Western sense, but that tend to either bring together or use the forces, the opposing forces or forces that are relatively inconsistent in order to move forward a particular strategy. And it was pretty critical at this point. We're in November by this point, and things are looking like they are not moving, except in one direction, which is a direction that was not really quite positive for the Chinese central authorities. Right? We have the the Chinese central authorities have been very good at developing a discursive stance very early in the process, June, July. The momentum, certainly in September, by the time we get to September, appeared to be shifting not wholly to the protesters in the international community, but enough to cause a little bit of worry. Right, the protesters had their 5 demands. They were moving much more openly, at least portions of the protesting community, much more openly towards an internationalist stance, moving the notion of autonomy perilously close to the notion of a sovereignty, of a divided sovereignty, where Chinese territorial and ultimate sovereignty would not be on the table. Everyone would agree that it's the Chinese flag that flies above, but that the operational sovereignty of Hong Kong would not be centered within the state. That is, it doesn't go up through Beijing, but instead would be centered in, guaranteed by, and understood through international norms and rules, starting with but not ending with the Sino-British Joint Declaration, but then moving very vigorously into notions of self-determination and autonomy, even within the territorial sovereignty of China, so that China effectively would have been viewed, at least according to some, and by November this is becoming more evident, would be viewed as, yes, getting back the land, but not really getting full, untrammeled control over the way that territory is administered, and that would either devolve, right, and there are two big variations. It would either devolve to the people of Hong Kong themselves, who would then have the authority to build their own vision of themselves within China, no matter how incompatible it might be with the Chinese political economic model, or it would be vested in under the management, the oversight of the international community as the protectors, so that Hong Kong becomes emblematic, a model international city like Singapore, but under a much more liberal, democratic, Western-oriented international norm regime. So that's a problem for the central authorities. And here we have just, and for me, this chapter is just marvelous. We have Xi Jinping really, in a sense, at his best. There's an opportunity here for China to necessarily make their case within the international sphere, right? And it has now become necessary because the protests in Hong Kong have become internationalized, at least with respect to its conceptual and its discursive framing. And at this point, the challenge for the central authorities is twofold. One is to try to make the case for the Chinese interpretation of one country beneath which are two systems, a case that they've been making more or less and more elaborately, certainly since the middle of the second decade of the 21st century. So this isn't a new position. The protests just accelerated and deepened rhetorics that had already been in development for a while. And so that was important, but really even more important than that, from the perspective of what appeared to be rising in the international community, was to try to drive a wedge in international public sentiment, so that in fact it wouldn't be China against the world and the protesters, but that there would be this space within which we have a solid Chinese position, and then we have discord within either the liberal democratic camp or within the international camp, depending on whose noses you were counting as being important in the context. And so chapter 20 actually then looks at the discursive power of the speech that he makes. And I believe that he makes this in Brasilia at the BRICS Leaders Conference there, in kind of a big summit for the South-South. And that was probably nicely chosen. You don't want to go to the North, the global North, to make this. You're going to want to go to a place where, at least theoretically, there might be a more welcoming audience, and that would have been in the emerging, increasingly frustrated, and increasingly energetic global South, Brazil, South Africa, et cetera. That's where you're going to want to make the speech, and that's where he goes, and that's what he does. And then he makes his case.
And I like how you analyze the speech. I think one of my favorite parts about this chapter is when you discuss like the percussion of the speech, the way, the rhythm in which he spoke. And one question that I'd like to ask you is, what was the significance of that?
Well, the way the discourse was set up here, the imagery, and of course, Xi Jinping's discourse has always been full of very interesting, usually very precise imagery. A lot of it resonates much more with Chinese audiences than with Western audiences, but he's gotten better at that, this painting with words. He's very good at that. And here we're painting imagery of storms, of violence, of the instability, right? That's the sense of typhoons, of hurricanes, of battering, and of a destructive force that is, by the nature of a weather event, a storm, chaotic in the sense that it tends to blow everything and everyone away, all order. There is no order, it is chaos. And against chaos, the only thing that one has, if you look at this discourse, is the stability and prosperity that can only be made possible through the one country, two systems vision that China has been elaborating, and with more consistency and more refinement, certainly since June of 2019. So yeah, it's this notion, the violence and chaos, the storm. It's those three words going round and round: violence, chaos, storms, unpredictable. It's, you have no idea who the victims. It will take naughty people as well as good people. It does not distinguish. And And it's just a wonderful, wonderful discursive device. And then you've got, like you said, the drumbeat, right? The drumbeat is persistent criminal acts, seriously trampling rule of law, seriously trampling social order, seriously undermining Hong Kong's prosperity, seriously undermining Hong Kong's stability, and seriously challenging the one country, two systems principle, with respect to which they offer only the chaos of a storm. Right?
Those narratives
so
aren't
here it is,
something.
this what I refer to as the basso ostinato, persistent, violent, criminal acts, boom, 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 over and over in a very nice percussive kind of sense, with respect to which there is safety, there is something that can be protective of what people may want, at least according to the discursive trajectories of this speech, which is stability and prosperity within a rule of law system, avoiding the lawlessness and violence that is the alternative that is being presented to the people of Hong Kong, and which the international community is being asked to become complicit in the violence, complicit in the instability, complicit in the chaos, and a complicity that will turn on them eventually.
And this isn't some narrative that is just, or rhetoric that's only used in China. I mean, this is something that is fairly similar to things we've seen around the world, or things we've seen said about protesters around the world in different countries. And so I just wonder what goes through the mind of a protester who hears this being said in a distant area, because you have to think change is going to come after this speech. Either change is going to come, or your reality is going to become a lot harsher. If you hear the speech, and if you notice the percussion that you hear, if you hear boom, 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 now you understand that there is going to be a response that is going to be validated by this speech, that is going to come to you, that is probably going to be harsher. And so, maybe it raises fears. Maybe that speech in itself was all you needed to stop, but probably isn't.
But remember that the speech isn't meant for the protesters, right? The protesters already know what is coming, because we've seen in earlier essays the theme of violent, lawless protesters then being countered by the protesters weakly, because they could have exploited this much more than they did, and they essentially gave the edge to the central authorities, and that is the notion that the protesters themselves put out, but for some reason not picked up to the same extent, of the equal, if not worse, lawlessness of the state. Individuals are not bound by, nor are they supported by, deep institutional structures that are themselves the font of responsibility on which their legitimacy is built. And so therefore, lawlessness in equal measure on the part of the instrumentalities of the state should be viewed as worse than the lawlessness of an emotive explosion coming out of the people. Right? That tends to be the way it works, for example, in the West. You're always going to judge the police more harshly than the protesters. And that, if you are talking to a Western audience, right, that's the counter melody that should have been playing and was not.
But I think the difference between the two of those is that one is justifying what they're doing, and that will be the protesters. And the other one is justifying what they're going to do. And I think that's a lot scarier for many people. Maybe that's just a Western perspective that I have.
Right. Well, also remember, you see what's coming.
Yes,
right?
That's true.
And they did too. The risk that something might come. And, and the central authorities were good at fanning risk, even if they had no intention of making good on them. Allowing pictures of military vehicles running around Shenzhen, pictures of having people say indiscreet things that could be ambiguously taken, and then letting people run with that. It's that's the nature of this kind of emotive interaction. But what the protesting community never did, especially since much of their support would have had to come from outside of China, the Chinese central authorities and the Chinese institutional structures were not going to be very open to them and their objectives, certainly not after its refinement and things ramped up after September. You know, their principal sources of support would have been the international community, and Xi Jinping understands this in a way. And at that point, the issue becomes, or the strategy becomes, how do you most effectively project narrative out onto a potentially key audience that you're either going to want to fractionalize, right, to facilitate fracture, or you want to keep them from actually deciding that this is serious enough or that the benefits are strong enough for them to project power in. The protesters had the opportunity at this point to try to do the opposite, if not by them, by their supporters in the international community. And for some reason, that does not play out as well as this.
Okay. Well, I understand where you come from that. I appreciate you discussing this chapter with me and breaking it down for everybody out there. And if you don't have anything else to add to this chapter, or anything you want to add to this chapter, because I know you have a lot more to add, but the ultimate goal is for the people to go out and buy the book. I hope that everyone goes out and buys the book and enjoys the book.
That's right. So yeah, no, so the only thing I'll do is and with a tease, right? All of this, the discursive, and again, recall that as you read this chapter, what I'm looking at is discourse. I'm not looking at the right or wrong of this from any perspective, nor am I pushing an agenda. But the most interesting part of this, at least for me, was its connection with deep and ancient rhetorical tools that in this case are quite potent, not just within a purely quote unquote Chinese and Chinese cultural context, but I think here really show its power in a transnational context as well. It really does leap here out of its traditional and historical context. And in a sense, for me, one of the most interesting things about this is I get done with this and I keep thinking, you know, it really is a shame that in the West, we don't study these cultural, rhetorical, discursive styles more, if only to get a better sense of how these then tend to frame, not just the way you say things, but the way in which you use them to impose meaning and to materialize strategic goals in ways that are very different from Western rhetorical styles. So I'll end with that. You're muted.
Oops. But yes, I look forward to us completing this book and doing more chapters. I'm glad that we're in the 20s now. We have hit another milestone. And so, you know, I have to make mention of that every single time. But as for everybody that is out there viewing us, all our viewers out there, I do hope you enjoyed this book. And thank you again for speaking with me this afternoon.
That's right. And take seriously Matthew's point, which I think is absolutely right. The interesting part of this, as you read it in the Hong Kong context, is to move it out of it to the context from which you all may be reading it, either from a European context or a Latin American or a North American context. And you can begin to see differences, similarities, and kind of the power of not just words, but the rhythms and choices of the way in which arguments are made and the underlying principles or presumptions that they tend to kind of activate. But anyway, thank you again, and I look forward to our next chapter.
All right.